The last voice to cross the choir pit was a child's, counting backwards from 10 in a calm, nursery cadence that belonged to no manifest, no passenger list, no official record that would survive the next hour's filing. 9, 8, 7. Each number fell with the measured precision of a catechism, spoken by lips that should have been forming prayers to the golden throne, not marking time toward an ending that had already been written in ledgers she would never see. Astropath Primary Vex held the psychic thread until it thinned to gossamer, then parted like a severed nerve. On his monitoring slate, convoy designation Theta 97 flickered from operational green to bureaucratic gray. Status unresolved, fate pending, prayers recommended as per Regulation 447 Zeta. In the Imperium of man, darkness is not merely an absence of light or hope. It is policy made manifest, a tool as precisely calibrated as any weapon in the Imperial arsenal. It marks territorial boundaries, extracts compliance from populations deemed expendable, and writes legislation in the cold, unlit spaces between stars where human screams carry no legal weight. The Void serves the throne not as enemy, but as administrator. Vex's scarred fingers moved across the brass interface with the mechanical devotion of 37 years spent translating human suffering into acceptable bureaucratic categories. His work was arithmetic disguised as prayer, attention allocated like rationed air, each psychic contact measured and logged according to the sacred protocols that kept the Imperium's nervous system functioning. Pain became Form LXI-null, terror transformed into Annex Phi Tertius. The choir servitors behind him bled dutifully into silver collection bowls. Their blood was weighed, catalogued, and tithed to the appropriate departments. Behind every scream that crossed the void lay a ledger. Behind every ledger lay a quota. Behind every quota lay the grinding certainty that someone, somewhere, was counting souls like ammunition. The astropathic chamber existed in perpetual twilight, its walls lined with psychically conductive brass that hummed with the whispered prayers of saints whose martyrdom had been carefully scheduled to maximize administrative efficiency. Here, in the depths of Segmentum Solar's primary relay station, Vex maintained his vigil over the Void's endless chatter. Distress calls from merchant vessels became shipping adjustment reports. Guard regiment casualties became recruitment opportunity assessments. The bureaucratic machinery of empire digested tragedy with the same methodical efficiency it applied to grain distribution and promethium allocation. Convoy Theta 97 had translated near the expanding shoals of the Ghoul stars, following routes mapped more by tradition than certainty. The official charts rendered these regions with bureaucratic tidiness, starless tracked, magnitude variable, transit discouraged without proper authorization. Chartists called such routes shortcuts. Administrators classified them as acceptable risk. The people who crossed them used different names, words that rarely survived the censorship boards and never appeared in official reports. Some ships returned from these regions with crew counts that defied their embarkation records, with new shrines hammered from bulkhead scrap, and with children who refused to sleep unless all lights were extinguished. Most vessels simply vanished, leaving behind only the kind of silence that felt textured, as if it pressed back against those who listened too carefully. The hush protocols existed for both outcomes. These were not merely directives for communication discipline, but a comprehensive doctrine that transformed cosmic horror into manageable policy. At predetermined intervals across the Imperium's shipping lanes, bells ceased their tolling. Sermons reduced to whispered breath. Children learned to wrap their laughter in cloth and speak only when spoken to. The official justification invoked warp predators and the need for psychic concealment. But Vex understood the deeper arithmetic. Silence starved rumor, smoothed compliance, and kept atmospheric consumption within acceptable parameters. In the Starless regions, it served additional functions that appeared in no manual, but were understood by every officer who had survived more than one tour in the outer reaches. As Vex processed the convoy's final transmission, he noted anomalies that would not appear in his official report. Micro-intervals in the static, repeating at precisely 113 heartbeats, too regular for random interference, too organic for machine malfunction. Power allocation requests in the convoy's recent communications that exceeded standard requirements by factors suggesting either plague containment or systematic population adjustment. Passenger manifest amendments that added names faster than normal processing protocols should allow. Medical supply requisitions that painted a picture of either epidemic or organized violence. The administratum possessed procedures for transforming such anomalies into acceptable narratives. A vanished convoy became a row in a ledger, with columns for tonnage, cargo classification, and spiritual deficit. Vox ghosts were cross-referenced against prior incidents and assigned to predetermined narrative categories for distribution to local shrines. Losses converted seamlessly into quotas. Dead pilgrims relieved pressure on grain allocation systems. Missing freighters released promethium reserves held against theoretical siege scenarios. The machine of empire metabolized absence into fuel more reliable than hope, more sustainable than truth. The archives preserved fragments of testimony from the few who returned from the expanding dead zones. A deckhand from the pilgrim barge, Sancta Helia, described shadows that bent toward human breath. A gunner's mate from a troop transport reported machine spirits that learned unauthorized prayers in the darkness and refused to forget them. A child from a supply lighter, one of the precious few survivors, claimed the black outside the viewports was close enough to touch and strangely polite. She had counted backwards to make it retreat. 10, 9, 8. The inquisitorial seal that closed her transcript was always clean, always fresh. The pages beneath remained blank. Vex completed his paperwork with the ritual precision his office demanded. Disappearance report. Routine classification. Status: unresolved. Probable causes listed in descending order of palatability. Navigational error. Pirate depredation. Xeno's ambush. Warp anomaly. Supplementary notation. Anomalous signal patterns detected. Recommend peer review. Authorized responses. Distribute comfort narratives to affected population centers. Adjust tithe expectations to reflect projected shortfalls. Implement extended hush protocols along adjacent shipping routes. He stamped the report with his personal sigil and forwarded it through the appropriate channels, another data point in the vast calculus of acceptable loss that kept the Imperium functioning. The guidance that arrived bore the weight of centuries of precedent. Starless transit occurrences fell under Edict 847M41, Subclause Tertius. Apply hush expansion protocols. Minimize secondary curiosity vectors among civilian populations. Prepare loyal narratives for immediate distribution. As Vex acknowledged the directive and set his choir to the low, harmonious chanting that smoothed thoughts into orderly channels, He passed a novice asleep at her monitoring post. Her lips moved in unconscious rhythm. 10, 9, 8. He did not wake her. In the shipping registry, a new entry appeared with routine efficiency. Mass conveyor penitent's dream, route approved, cargo classification sealed, priority authorization confirmed. The registry entry triggered cascades across a dozen departments within the hour, each authorization stamp activating protocols that had waited in bureaucratic dormancy, like spores in a sealed vault. Starless Edict 847, M41, possessed the elegant efficiency of all Imperial policy. It transformed cosmic horror into administrative procedure, rendering the incomprehensible manageable through the careful application of forms, seals, and sanctified violence. Its formal designation filled 3 pages of parchment, but among those who implemented its provisions, the colloquial term was simpler and more honest. Necessary blindness. Segmentum Command translated uncertainty into colored zones on strategic displays, each hue corresponding to predetermined response protocols. The Navis nobility circulated advisories wrapped in polite menace. Stellar occlusion probable. Third eye exposure to be minimized. Deviation from prescribed routes punishable by charter revocation. The Adeptus Mechanicus appended technical specifications for cargo requiring enhanced containment protocols, their binary cant, encoding warnings that only the initiated could decipher. The Ecclesiarche provided liturgical frameworks to sanctify reduction, teaching the faithful to count inward and accept emptiness as devotion. The Commissariat distributed training materials for what the annexes termed sectional adjustment procedures. The Administratum, possessed of neither saints nor patience for mystery, prepared narrative templates for shrine bulletins, stories with endings pre-approved for civic stability. The mass conveyor penitent's dream had been selected not for her cargo capacity or defensive armament, but for her compliance record and the particular configuration of her life support systems. Her hull bore the scars of 40 years' faithful service, adamantium plates patched with metals older than some worlds she serviced, corridors that had learned to echo prayers in 17 different dialects, and modification scars that told stories no technical manual would record. Recent retrofits had enhanced her atmospheric recycling capacity, while simultaneously installing bulkhead seals rated for rapid compartment isolation. The shipyard documentation described these as safety improvements, but their implementation followed patterns typically associated with controlled population reduction rather than emergency response. Captain Mordian received his sealed orders in the privacy of his personal chapel, where scrolls bearing the names of souls safely delivered lined walls that seemed smaller each year. His record remained unblemished not through luck, but through understanding. The Administratum valued mission completion over sentiment, and Mordian had learned to measure success in terms that satisfied ledgers rather than conscience. He signed the receipt with the same narrow brush he used for prayer, copying the operative clauses into his private log with a hand that never wavered. The orders granted him authority to implement population management protocols as circumstances required, language that liberated him from certain questions while binding him to others. Tec Dominus Keth 9 arrived with the dawn and an invoice that would never be calculated in throne gelt. His augmetic modifications exceeded standard patterns for his rank, chrome, and ceramite, having claimed territories where flesh once ruled. He supervised the installation of cargo, designated only as Noctilith Adjacent Materials, Priority Authorization Omega. Obsidian facets nested in geometric lattices that refused simple measurement, studded with power couplings that drank energy like parched pilgrims approaching sacred wells. The cargo's requirements stripped 11.3% from the ship's baseline power generation. Kilowatts diverted from comfort systems and auxiliary batteries once reserved for emergency maneuvers. Keth 9 signed authorizations, placing primary containment above secondary respiration without apparent consideration that this represented a choice. Navigator Lysander belonged to a minor house whose genetic stability had suffered from generations of exposure to routes existing at the margins of Imperial charts. His third eye wept constantly, requiring hourly applications of blessed unguents containing compounds typically reserved for treating warp burn. The Navis Nobilite had classified his condition as acceptable deterioration, necessary sacrifice for maintaining navigation services, where normal pilots suffered immediate dissolution. His charts contained annotations in scripts predating Imperial Gothic, warnings written in languages that described hazards appearing with clockwork regularity in regions where stars had never shone. Confessor Hadrian administered spiritual preparation with surgical precision, his sermons calibrated to induce the particular blend of hope and resignation that rendered populations manageable during extended void transit. He installed hymn cylinders in the ship's Vox system, their low frequencies designed to smooth the edges of fear without numbing duty. His litanies were catalogued by function rather than season, calming, quickening, resigning, draining. He visited the sealed cargo bay and spoke blessings that did not include names, then inspected the chapel's atmospheric scrubbers and requested numbers that told him how many candles he could light without stealing air from the faithful. Commissar Voss maintained order through regulations existing in supplementary codices distributed only to officers with appropriate clearance. His bolt pistol contained blessed ammunition, consecrated specifically for use against Imperial citizens whose loyalty remained unquestioned, but whose continued existence had become administratively inconvenient. He drilled squads not in charge or countercharge, but in seal verification, compartment counts, and orderly withdrawal that could be redirected toward sacrifice as circumstances demanded. The passenger manifest exceeded design specifications through mathematical precision rather than oversight. 17,000 pilgrims had been approved for transport in holds designed for 12,000 souls, the excess representing faithful who had purchased passage through spiritual currency. Extended fasting, voluntary labor, participation in experimental prayer cycles, testing boundaries between devotion and medical research. They underwent conditioning, emphasizing sacrifice's virtue, obedience's necessity, and suffering's sacred nature when endured in service to the Golden Throne. As departure approached, the penitent's dream settled into configurations that served purposes beyond her apparent mission. Modified atmospheric systems that could process air from reduced populations with greater efficiency. Expanded medical facilities designed for casualties from routine void hazards while maintaining operational capacity. Reinforced bulkheads with independent life support that could be sealed and vented without affecting primary ship functions. Though Technical specifications described safety improvements, but their implementation revealed deeper arithmetic. The ship departed during shift change, when attention focused elsewhere and documentation processed through automated systems that preserved no memories. As she translated toward regions where darkness pressed close enough to whisper suggestions that sounded remarkably like Imperial policy, the penitent's dream carried more than pilgrims and cargo. She bore the weight of systematic necessity, institutional logic made manifest in riveted adamantium and human flesh, sailing toward coordinates where theory would meet practice in the cold mathematics of acceptable loss. The penitent's dream breathed with the labored rhythm of a dying thing, her atmospheric processes cycling air through 17,000 pairs of lungs before returning it, depleted and metallic, to ducts that had learned to whisper. Each inhalation carried the weight of recycled prayers and the mathematics of survival. 590 grams of oxygen per soul per standard day at minimal activity, scrubbers rated for 12,000 bodies operating indefinitely, 16,000 for 6 weeks only if non-essential compartments remained sealed. The numbers circulated like catechism among crew chiefs who drilled the arithmetic of mercy into scribes whose styluses stayed sharp with necessity. Children adapted first, their smaller lungs requiring less, and their unformed consciences accepting rationed air as another devotion to memorize. They stopped running in corridors, not because they were forbidden, but because they began to hear the walls inhale and exhale, the ship's hull expanding and contracting with an organic regularity that made thought move in measured loops. When the exchangers throttled down, conversation thinned. When they surged, laughter came quickly, as if paying back accumulated debt to the recycling systems that kept them breathing. Economies formed with the precision of coinage long anticipated. Breath chits appeared within the first week, machine-stamped tin squares punched from reclaimed panels, each buying 10 minutes near the chapel's private scrubbers, or a meal without the extra pinch of desiccant that made water taste of old metal. Lumen cells commanded premium exchange rates, their pale illumination providing psychological comfort that made reduced oxygen more bearable. Sleeping positions near heat exchangers traded for access to cleaner air, families surrendering children to strangers whose alcoves received better airflow, payment rendered in labor hours, and promises of future devotion. The ship's architecture enforced hierarchy through vertical stratification. Sleeping racks stacked 12 high created class distinctions measured in breathable air. Those on bottom breathed dust, and the exhalations of 11 others, those on top, breathed warmth and the illusion of space. Ladders became toll roads where men with tattered badges charged, chits for passage. In the mess halls, scrawled lists marked seats closest to heat exchangers as reserved for penitents whose labors had earned temporary reprieve from the cold. Permission could be rescinded without explanation, because uncertainty fed compliance better than punishment. The hush protocols evolved from practical necessity into sacred ritual through use rather than decree. What began as toned vox chimes and Confessor Hadrian's soft instruction to guard thought expanded within days into cloth-swaddled bells, and tap languages passed between children who remembered similar voyages. Merchants bartered in gestures, fingers counting against palms to close deals beneath enforced silence. Pilgrims practiced stillness as penance, while lungs fought the urge to sigh. their compliance measured by crew chiefs who recorded violations as tick marks on wax boards, not to punish, but to calculate atmospheric consumption with the precision of any vital resource. Tech Dominus Keth 9 monitored these adaptations through surveillance systems that recorded everything while officially observing nothing. His augmetic modifications included respiratory bypasses that freed him from dependence on the ship's struggling life support, allowing him to walk corridors where pilgrims gasped like landed fish without experiencing their distress. He filed reports describing optimal passenger adaptation to enhanced efficiency protocols, while authorizing additional power diversions from life support to the sealed cargo's insatiable requirements. The noctilith-adjacent materials pulsed with energies that registered on instruments designed to measure warp phenomena, their obsidian surfaces reflecting lights that originated from no visible source. During extended hush periods, the ship's hull transmitted vibrations that seemed to originate from sources other than mechanical systems. Low harmonics pulsed through the superstructure with rhythms that matched neither engine cycles nor atmospheric processes, frequencies that resonated in human bones and suggested presence rather than machinery. A vent technician named Kale scraped fungus from clogged ducts and warned his apprentice never to look into the long runs when fans were off. Not because there was anything to see, but because hungry imagination would populate any corridor with watchers. The apprentice nodded, then broke the rule next shift, and stared until flat black seemed to gather, as if about to pronounce a name. Captain Mordian felt the ship's heartbeat through deck plates as he stood between bridge and chapel, reviewing petitions with hands that trembled slightly when power fluctuations announced the cargo's increasing demands. Navigator Lysander ate little and vomited often, his third eye weeping constantly as pressure built at the edge of perception, texture rather than weight, like fingertips finding microscopic ridges on surfaces that appeared smooth. He requested brief halts, citing tremors in the guiding light that only he could sense. His requests came stamped advisory only. Confessor Hadrian tuned hymn cylinders with mechanic's attention and priest's hands, selecting low frequencies that slipped through steel and flesh to coax breath into communal rhythm. Pilgrims learned to inhale at verse crests and exhale where harmonics fell, enforced solidarity that reduced coughing fits and saved fractions of air that, aggregated, translated into whole lives over long transit. The infrasonic hymns grew more frequent as the ship progressed toward regions where stellar cartography became theoretical, their low frequencies inducing calm that made oxygen deprivation bearable. In the deepest holds, where darkness gathered like pooled water and hush protocols extended for entire shifts, passengers began drawing geometric patterns with fingertips on condensation-slicked bulkheads, the designs repeated across sections without conscious coordination, as if something in the approaching starless void was teaching them a language written in mathematics and desperation. Power fluctuations announced themselves through the taste of air. When sealed, cargo drew heavy, oxygen grew flat and metallic, hair lifting along forearms. When the hum deepened into patterns that matched quiet counting, some had begun without being taught. The daily reports maintained respectful fictions, all systems within tolerance, pilgrim populace compliant, minor injuries consistent with typical transit. Beneath the numbers, old calculus gathered momentum toward inevitable answer. The ship was teaching them how to live with less, preparing them for lessons written in the cold arithmetic of acceptable loss. Ahead lay regions where guiding light thinned, and instruments returned readings that resembled harm. The corridors were already practicing the next doctrine without knowing its name, voices stepping aside for mechanism's geometry. 17,000 breaths moving as one body toward coordinates where theory would meet practice in the starless dark. The ship had taught them to breathe less. Now it taught them where to look and when to stop looking. Control aboard the penitent's dream operated through overlapping spheres of authority that never quite touched, each officer maintaining jurisdiction over domains that served the vessel's true purpose while preserving comfortable fictions about passenger transport through dangerous void. The geometry of command mapped cleanly onto bulkheads and hatches, transforming human will into steel necessity through the careful application of forms, seals, and sanctified violence. Captain Mordian stood at the keystone where authority converged, his cabin containing sealed orders that would open automatically at predetermined coordinates. His oath bound him not to the passengers who trusted him with their lives, but to administratum functionaries who had calculated their worth in terms more precise than prayer. The words fit his mouth too, easily. Deliver what must be delivered. Preserve function over comfort. Preserve mission over sentiment. His command tree mapped security cordons to maintenance choke points, mess queues to crowd control lanes, each hatch that mattered marked with red line thresholds that made obedience visible. Tech Dominus Keth 9 wrapped control in calculation, his augmetic modifications including respiratory bypasses that freed him from dependence on the ship's struggling life support. He possessed exclusive jurisdiction over the sealed cargo bay, its noctilith-adjacent materials drawing energy that exceeded baseline generation capacity. His authorization elevated primary containment above all secondary systems, implementing resource reallocation protocols that rearranged the ship's energy economy with surgical precision. Power diversions from life support to cargo requirements occurred so gradually that crew felt only aggregate effects, lumen strings running cooler, pumps taking longer cycles, atmospheric processors throttling back between shifts. The obsidian lattices pulsed with increasing intensity, their void shield fluctuations matching the cargo's energy output, as if broadcasting something into the darkness. Confessor Hadrian administered spiritual preparation with psychological precision, his sermons calibrated to induce compliance and resignation that rendered populations manageable during extended void transit. The hymn cylinders he tuned served dual purpose, their infrasonic frequencies penetrating steel and flesh to condition passenger behavior while providing spiritual comfort. At 17 cycles, the low roll fluttered eyelids and damped flight reflexes. At 19, lungs synchronized with shared rhythm. At 21, thought softened around edges where panic might gain purchase. The chapel's atmospheric scrubbers operated at enhanced efficiency, not merely for comfort, but to create zones of breathable air that could be restricted or expanded as circumstances demanded. Navigator Lysander's growing unease manifested in physical symptoms that Medica documented as routine warp exposure, while privately noting deeper disturbances. His stellar readings became increasingly impossible as they approached the Starless zone, instruments returning data that violated fundamental navigation principles. Stars appeared where none should exist, then vanished when observed directly. His third eye wept constantly, blessed unguents providing only temporary relief from pressure originating outside normal space-time. The Astronomicon shimmered at perception's edge, like a great heart seen through water, its pulse indistinguishable from memory. Commissar Voss prepared for sectional adjustment implementation with methodical precision, these procedures existing in supplementary codices, distributed only to officers with appropriate clearance. He drilled squads not in charge or counter-charge, but in seal verification. 3 clips, 2 turns, 1 press. Each passenger compartment had been surveyed and classified according to strategic value. Essential personnel, useful labor, acceptable losses, priority adjustments. The categories shifted daily based on atmospheric consumption, medical requirements, and behavioral compliance scores calculated by surveillance systems that recorded everything while officially observing nothing. The hush protocols had evolved beyond original parameters, extending from scheduled periods to entire shifts as psychological conditioning rather than tactical necessity. Passengers developed gestural languages and tap codes beneath enforced quiet, their compliance measured by crew chiefs who recorded violations not to punish, but to identify individuals whose continued existence might compromise group survival. Children learned to wrap laughter in cloth and speak only when spoken to, their adaptation monitored through surveillance systems that felt where people gathered without having to see. The ship's modifications revealed their true purpose through systematic preparation for controlled population reduction. Reinforced bulkheads with independent life support could be sealed and vented without affecting primary functions. Enhanced medical facilities processed casualties from routine hazards while maintaining operational capacity. Modified atmospheric systems processed air from reduced populations with greater efficiency. The penitent's dream was no longer merely transport vessel, but carefully constructed experiment, a crucible where imperial policy refined methods of population control. As they approached coordinates where stellar cartography became theoretical, power allocation became the ship's primary concern. The sealed cargo's requirements continued expanding, each day bringing new diversions from life support, medical facilities, emergency reserves. Tech Dominus Keth 9 authorized systematic shutdowns of non-essential systems, a category that expanded to include heating, auxiliary lighting, backup atmospheric processors. The mathematics were simple. Cargo containment took precedence over passenger comfort, survival, and ultimately existence. The geometric patterns pilgrims drew on condensation-slicked bulkheads grew more complex, as if something in approaching darkness taught them language they would need to understand. The ship breathed around them with increasing difficulty, atmospheric processors laboring to maintain life support for populations exceeding design specifications by calculated margins. Ahead lay regions where theory would meet practice, where institutional horror would shed bureaucratic disguise and reveal machinery that ground human lives into acceptable statistics. Control held through careful preparation, each system serving the singular purpose of demonstrating the Imperium's ability to manage its populace, even when management required consuming its own. The threshold arrived without ceremony, marked not by stellar landmarks, but by the slow, deliberate unwinding of reality itself. Navigator Lysander felt it first as pressure behind his third eye, the Emperor's guiding light thinning like blood in water until the Astronomicon became whispered memory rather than blazing certainty. His navigation chamber filled with the metallic taste of psychic feedback as instruments registered the impossible. Constellations that existed only in theoretical mathematics, star patterns describing geometries, human minds were not designed to process. The blessed unguents failed completely as his third eye wept blood, each drop marking another degree of separation from the light that had guided humanity across the galaxy for 10 millennia. Chronometers throughout the ship began drifting from synchronized Imperial standard, their mechanisms responding to temporal distortions that made causality negotiable. The main display showed elapsed transit time at 17 days, 14 hours, 31 minutes, but individual timepieces registered everything from 3 weeks to negative intervals, each settling into rhythms that matched neither engine cycles nor human heartbeats, but something older and infinitely more patient. Crew chiefs abandoned precise scheduling in favor of shift bells that rang when atmospheric pressure suggested the need for organized breathing, rather than when regulations demanded it. The Auspex arrays painted pictures of space that folded back on itself like origami made from light and vacuum. Sensor ghosts appeared at impossible distances, massive signatures registering as ships, asteroids, small moons, and occasionally as structures too geometrically perfect to occur naturally. When observed directly through optical arrays, these phantoms vanished, leaving only the texture of space that seemed to watch back with patient attention. The void outside did not brighten or darken. It consolidated, becoming something that possessed weight and intention. The ship's ancient hull began singing with harmonics that originated from no mechanical source, low frequencies that resonated through adamantium plates and into human bones with organic regularity. The sound felt like vocal cords learning to breathe in languages that predated human speech, corridor acoustics changing so that voices carried farther than physics should allow, while footsteps seemed muffled by atmosphere that had grown thick and somehow attentive. Maintenance crews reported that the hull's song answered itself from distances the ship was not designed to measure, creating standing waves that made cutlery shiver and children hold their jaws. Emergency lighting cast red shadows that moved independently of their sources, geometric patterns shifting across bulkheads in configurations that matched the designs passengers had been drawing without conscious coordination. The shadows possessed weight and texture, pressing against surfaces like hands exploring unfamiliar territory, while children pointed at empty corners and whispered about watchers who stood very still and counted backwards in voices that sounded like their own. The Mechanicus cargo's power consumption spiked beyond all previous measurements, its noctilith-adjacent materials drawing energy that stripped life support systems to survival minimums. Tech Dominus Keth 9 authorized emergency diversions that reduced atmospheric processing to baseline thresholds, each kilowatt redirected from human comfort to cargo containment, representing calculated sacrifice. The obsidian lattices pulsed with frequencies that made nearby metal sing, their void shields fluctuating in patterns that seemed less like protection than advertisement, broadcasting signals into the starless dark with disciplined precision. Passengers reported shared nightmares with documentary accuracy, their dreams featuring identical geometric cities floating in the void between galaxies, inhabited by consciousness that experienced time as humans experienced space. The dream cities possessed architecture that hurt to remember, structures built from mathematics describing impossible angles and surfaces existing in more dimensions than human perception could process. These visions lingered beyond sleep, leaving residue of alien logic that compelled fingers to trace patterns on condensation-slicked bulkheads with precision their conscious minds did not possess. Confessor Hadrian increased sermon frequency to counter rising psychological disturbance, his litanies blending prayer with crowd control as passengers exhibited symptoms of collective dissociation. The infrasonic hymns grew more frequent and intense, their low frequencies inducing calm that made oxygen deprivation bearable while conditioning behavior through resonance that bypassed conscious thought. He installed additional hymn cylinders throughout passenger compartments, their synchronized harmonics creating standing waves that guided crowd movement and suppressed panic responses with surgical precision. Commissar Voss prepared sectional adjustment protocols with clinical efficiency, these procedures existing in classified annexes that transformed population reduction into administrative routine. His squads drilled compartment sealing while passengers slept, practicing the careful choreography of systematic venting that could eliminate thousands while preserving ship function. The bolt rounds in his sidearm contained blessed ammunition, consecrated specifically for use against Imperial citizens whose loyalty remained unquestioned, but whose continued existence had become administratively inconvenient. The crucial detail that would not appear in any official log was the void shield's true function. They fluctuated in patterns matching the cargo's energy output, not as defensive barriers, but as transmitters projecting complex signals into the vast, patient darkness. The ship was no longer merely traveling through the starless void, but actively radiating into it, broadcasting geometric languages that manifested as shadows dancing across walls and patterns bleeding through dreams into waking consciousness. Navigator Lysander filed his final coherent report with trembling hands. Stellar readings impossible. Chronometer synchronization failed. Position undefined. His private notation contained one sentence that captured their situation with terrifying precision. Our position is a verb. As the penitent's dream penetrated deeper into regions where darkness possessed texture and intelligence, the ship's systems began responding to influences that appeared in no technical manual, their collective experience becoming a single, resonant note in the void that something vast and hungry had begun to answer. The ship had taught them to breathe less. Now it taught them to consume themselves with methodical precision. What began as rationed air became an economy built on last breaths, passengers stripping non-essential systems for heat while trading fragments of their own survival like currency in a market that understood the exact weight of human desperation. Families surrendered children's clothing to insulate pipes carrying breathable air to sections deemed strategically vital, mothers calculating the thermal value of their own hair, while fathers offered tools inherited across generations in exchange for proximity to functioning atmospheric scrubbers. The breath-chit economy had evolved beyond simple barter into complex hierarchies, measured in fractions of degrees and milliliters of clean air. Each machine-stamped tin square, worn smooth by desperate fingers, bought 10 minutes near the chapel's private scrubbers, where Confessor Hadrian's enhanced atmospheric systems created pockets of breathable air that felt like benediction against lungs accustomed to recycled exhalation. Families pooled resources to purchase single breaths for elderly members whose respiratory systems had begun failing, their sacrifice measured in the careful arithmetic of who deserved to continue breathing. Confessor Hadrian did not abolish this market, but sanctified it, transforming desperation into devotion through votive pauses, slips of parchment authorizing additional inhalations during prescribed litanies in exchange for service in corridor cleaning details and devotional labor. He rationed candles by oxygen expenditure, counting flames as carefully as souls, while the faithful lined to confess trespasses, measured in breaths stolen during hush periods. Absolution arrived as assignments to stillness squads, groups trained to slow their metabolisms with prayer until pulse and hymn became indistinguishable. The infrasonic hymns had thickened like fog, their frequencies tuned to 19 hertz when coughs rattled too loudly, to 21 when panic lifted in waves, to 17 when sleep withheld its charity. The low roll penetrated steel and flesh to find bone and convince it, passengers adjusting unconsciously to inhale at verse crests and exhale where harmonics fell. Those who could not learn the timing were shepherded to the chapel, where candles burned under careful oversight, their flames measured in millimeters, and surrendered when smoke began to cost more than comfort. Black markets proliferated in the seams between official rationing and human need. Blessed air decanted from the chapel's scrubbers into polished reliquaries commanded premium rates, thumb-sized ampoules fetching weeks' worth of ration stamps if sellers could prove provenance through ribbons soaked in incense and tied around necks. Breath debts bound families across generations, children sold into respiratory servitude before drawing their first independent breath, their future oxygen mortgaged against parents' desperate present needs. The hush protocols had expanded from scheduled periods to permanent condition, entire sections operating under enforced silence that transformed communication into gestural languages, and tap codes passed between passengers who remembered similar voyages from dreams they could not quite recall. Children learned to articulate complex needs through hand signals, their small fingers weaving narratives of thirst and cold that bypassed the need for sound. Adults communicated in shared glances and subtle nods, each movement a silent negotiation for space, warmth, and moments of blessed, unmonitored breath. Tech Dominus Keth 9 monitored these adaptations through surveillance systems that felt where people gathered without having to see them, his augmetic modifications freeing him from dependence on the ship's struggling life support. The Mechanicus cargo continued drawing power exceeding all previous calculations, its noctilith-adjacent materials pulsing with frequencies that made nearby metal sing harmonics describing geometries. Human perception was not designed to process. Each kilowatt diverted from life support to cargo containment represented calculated sacrifice, atmospheric efficiency dropping to 83%, then 81%, before crawling back under rationing pushes that saw entire decks spend sleep shifts on their sides, breaths halved by decree. The geometric patterns passengers drew on condensation-slicked bulkheads had grown more complex, spreading like contagion through proximity rather than instruction. These were no longer random scribbles, but precise, repetitive designs drawn without conscious awareness, fingers moving across cold metal as if guided by unseen instruction. Passengers in certain sections reported feeling watched by empty spaces, the sensation so pervasive they began addressing the void in whispers, offering silent prayers to presences that held their edges, too long in peripheral vision. Survival demanded specialization in the economy of last breaths. Scrubber-turners, small, sharp-fingered youths who could slip into maintenance shafts, bartered speed for favor. Vent technicians mapped corridors of breathable air and charged for knowledge. Crew chiefs formalized these practices into work rotas, pinned to bulkheads, with nails pried from sacrificial benches, the lower corners holding lists headlined in reluctant hands. Names transferred to adjustment reserve. Quartermaster Hale's chalkboards sprouted new columns, titled Contingencies, tracking oxygen consumption alongside grain and water in mathematics that translated appetite into risk. He auctioned sleeping positions near heat exchangers on rotating schedules that made precedents feel fair while preserving favorable ledgers for crew. Proof of labor was stamps. Stamps bred counterfeits. Counterfeits bred inspections that confiscated genuine stamps to maintain ratios. Captain Mordian signed new clauses in his sealed orders, authorizing sectional adjustment theta if atmospheric efficiency dipped below 82% for 2 consecutive cycles. The authorization needed no voicing. It traveled the ducts as temperature change, as pressure differential, as the ship's hull learning to sing with harmonics that answered something vast and patient in the starless dark. Commissar Voss had his squad sleep in their boots. The ship practiced its final lesson before the hour. Not moving at all, pumps eased to lowest working settings, hymn cylinders rolling out tones so deep they felt like bedrock shifting. People lay arranged by rotas, ribs rising in narrow, rehearsed arcs. In the sealed bay, the lattice's pulse synchronized to that practiced breath. The watchers in corners held still with their counting. The ship exhaled to the planned mark, and did not, for a long moment, inhale. The moment arrived with bureaucratic precision, power failing ship-wide during what the duty logs would record as routine sectional adjustment theta implementation. The failure cascaded through systems with mechanical obedience, emergency lighting dying in sequential waves as 17,000 souls found themselves floating in absolute darkness that pressed against exposed skin like velvet soaked in ice water. The ship's hull ceased its familiar mechanical breathing and began resonating with harmonics that seemed to originate from spaces between atoms, frequencies describing geometries that human consciousness was never designed to navigate. In weightless dark, passengers discovered that familiar surfaces had become strangers. Hands reaching for known bulkhead seams found metal too smooth where rivets should interrupt the adamantium, too warm where cold should reign, geometrically impossible where corridors bent in directions that violated the ship's blueprints. Children who had learned navigation by touch during hush periods now pressed palms against walls that seemed to breathe independently of atmospheric processors, their small fingers tracing patterns that matched designs they had been drawing without understanding why. Time unthreaded completely. Chronometers throughout the ship began displaying impossible readings, some frozen at the moment of power failure, others spinning backward through negative intervals, a few counting steadily upward toward numbers that had no meaning in Imperial standard. Captain Mordian watched his bridge timer advance normally, while the steward's pocket watch ticked backward against his palm, each reversed second pulling breath from the room, like a miser reclaiming coins. The Mechanicus cargo's containment field collapsed with a sound like reality, tearing along perforated edges, releasing something that existed in spaces between photons, where light had never learned to travel. Tech Dominus Keth 9 felt the breach through augmetic sensors registering impossible readings. Negative mass, inverted temperature, electromagnetic signatures describing colors that possessed no names in human language. The Noctilith adjacent materials scattered their obsidian facets like seeds in a void garden, each fragment broadcasting geometric languages into darkness that responded with patient, terrible attention. Navigator Lysander's scream began as human agony and transformed into something else entirely, as his third eye made contact with intelligence vast beyond measurement, consciousness that experienced time as humans experienced space, and found their linear existence quaintly limited. Through his shattered perception, he glimpsed truth that would never appear in official logs. The starless regions were not empty, but inhabited by entities that built cities from mathematics and dwelt in angles between thoughts, waiting with geological patience for humanity to develop sufficient psychic resonance to serve as translators between their realm and the material universe. In the choir chamber, astropaths began speaking in perfect unison, despite having no contact with each other for weeks. Their voices described identical visions with documentary precision, geometric cities floating in void between galaxies, architecture built from crystallized time and inhabited by consciousness that regarded human civilization as a brief, interesting experiment in organized suffering. The cities possessed libraries containing complete histories of species that had achieved transcendence by learning to think in dimensions beyond the standard three, their accumulated knowledge available to any race willing to pay the price of abandoning linear existence. Captain Mordian authorized sectional adjustment theta from his command throne, hands moving across controls he could not see, while the ship's machine spirit whispered calculations in binary cant that translated human lives into acceptable losses. The authorization traveled through systems that had learned to think independently, activating seals that would preserve ship function while eliminating mathematically determined excess population. His voice carried across Vox systems with mechanical precision, each word carefully chosen to transform mass murder into administrative necessity. Hatches spun with hydraulic finality. Seals locked. The ship made itself smaller, not by moving walls, but by withdrawing permission for certain souls to continue breathing. Air ceased being communal resource and became statement, argument, weapon. In the vented sections, nothing dramatic occurred. No roar, no tearing wind. Temperature fell a few degrees, then many. Breath crystallized, then stopped forming. People arranged by rota lay still as drilled and waited for something to change. It did, although not for them. The deaths satisfied something in the darkness. As compartment after compartment emptied, each ending life created ripples in the psychic medium that the geometric entities found nourishing, their alien consciousness feeding on emotional resonance of betrayal and despair. The hull's keening song subsided. Pressure in surviving astropaths' minds eased. The void outside pressed closer. No longer empty space, but organized attention that had learned to speak the language of human institutional horror. When power returned after 17 hours, the penitent's dream ran quieter than she had in decades, as if relieved of a burden carried too long. Official logs recorded successful repulsion of void predators through emergency maneuvers resulting in acceptable casualties. Commissar Voss ejected a spent charge he had not fired and examined it as if it might confess. Tech Dominus Keth 9 filed requisitions for replacement containment apparatus with schematics that looked nothing like what had failed, and exactly like what had worked. Confessor Hadrian translated orders into liturgy, so smoothly it felt like relief, his enhanced atmospheric scrubbers having maintained chapel pressure throughout the emergency. Memory adjustment protocols would ensure survivors' gratitude for salvation rather than recognition of systematic betrayal. In the starless void outside, something ancient and patient settled back into waiting, temporarily sated, but already calculating requirements for the next feeding. The survivors knew better than the official records, but their knowledge would be processed through institutional machinery designed to transform trauma into compliance, horror into gratitude, systematic murder into miraculous salvation. The ship sailed on through darkness that watched with geometric eyes, carrying the living and the grateful toward coordinates, where theory would meet practice in the cold mathematics of acceptable loss. The lights steadied to a color close enough to normal that 17,000 people could pretend they had not just witnessed systematic murder disguised as miraculous salvation. Each lumen string brightened in sequential waves, the ship's machine spirit, purring with the contentment of ledgers, finally balanced through the careful application of acceptable loss. The penitent's dream breathed easier now, her atmospheric processors cycling air through 9,853 pairs of lungs instead of 17,000. The mathematics of survival suddenly generous where they had been desperate only hours before. Casualty Report Form L. Thord Tertius arrived with dawn shift bells, its language chosen with surgical precision to transform mass death into bureaucratic routine. 7,847 souls lost to void exposure during emergency maneuvers necessitated by hostile contact with unidentified predatory entities. The numbers aligned across multiple documents with mathematical precision. Atmospheric consumption reduced by calculated margins, food stores extended by projected intervals, medical supplies reallocated to reflect diminished population requirements. Each death became a line item in ledgers that balanced human suffering against operational efficiency, with accounting practices refined across centuries of imperial administration. Captain Mordian received the first consolidated report while kneeling in his personal chapel, hands folded as though they might remember what absolution felt like. He signed the authorization with the same narrow brush he used for prayer, his personal logs recording the incident as textbook application of emergency population management during hostile contact. The sealed orders in his cabin had opened automatically during the crisis, revealing contingency plans that treated mass death as acceptable operational parameter. Language that liberated him from moral consideration while binding him to institutional necessity. Tech Dominus Keth 9 transitioned from emergency protocols to routine maintenance without visible seam, filing requisitions for replacement containment apparatus whose schematics bore identical designations to the devices that had failed, yet matched exactly what had functioned during the 17-hour darkness. The technical specifications revealed the first layer of systematic deception. The Noctilith-adjacent materials were not being transported for containment, but actively utilized as void attractors, their null field properties creating the Starless conditions that justified sectional adjustment protocols. The obsidian lattices had scattered like seeds throughout the ship's superstructure, their geometric fragments now integrated into systems that made metal sing with harmonics, describing impossible angles. Confessor Hadrian received official commendation, sealed with wax still warm, its language precise to the threshold of poetry. For maintenance of morale and doctrinal cohesion during crisis under the most holy light, his enhanced atmospheric scrubbers had preserved chapel pressure throughout the emergency, creating sanctuary that survivors remembered as miraculous intervention rather than systematic preparation. The commendation authorized expanded authority over passenger spiritual conditioning, granting him access to memory adjustment protocols typically reserved for inquisitorial operations. The memory adjustment procedures began immediately, administered through concentrated doses of infrasonic hymns calibrated to specific neural frequencies that bypassed conscious thought. Medicae servitors moved quietly through surviving compartments, with neural conditioning drafts that dulled the sharp edges of trauma and replaced them with carefully constructed narratives. The screams of the vented became the blessed silence of the martyred. The impossible geometries glimpsed in darkness became visions of the Emperor's divine plan. The pervasive sensation of being watched was reinterpreted as the ever-present gaze of the Golden Throne, protecting its faithful. Survivors underwent selective neural editing that transformed systematic betrayal into miraculous salvation, their memories processed through institutional machinery designed to convert trauma into compliance. Too early and conscious memory resisted modification. Too late and psychological scarring became permanent. The timing required precision that spoke of extensive practice across multiple operations, each survivor emerging with profound gratitude for their continued existence that felt authentic even as it was manufactured. Navigator Lysander's sealed testimony, classified beyond normal security protocols, described entities that were not predators, but observers, ancient consciousness that studied species development through their responses to systematic stress. They fed not on human flesh, but on the psychic resonance generated by institutional betrayal, finding particular nourishment in the emotional frequencies produced when authority figures sacrificed those they were sworn to protect. His third eye continued weeping at regular intervals that matched neither his pulse nor the ship's chronometers, bleeding through cloth in patterns that resembled the geometric designs passengers had drawn without conscious awareness. The pattern extended beyond the penitent's dream, through archived records that painted a picture of systematic population management disguised as emergency response to external threats. Similar incidents occurred across multiple shipping lanes with clockwork regularity, each carrying identical Mechanicus cargo and implementing identical adjustment protocols. Pilgrim fleets vanished in convenient numbers that corresponded precisely to overcrowding projections on destination worlds. Guard transports suffered calculated casualties that eliminated politically problematic regiments. Merchant convoys experienced raids that adjusted trade balances according to administratum requirements. Commissar Voss processed survivor testimonies through classification filters that transformed eyewitness accounts into acceptable narratives for distribution to affected population centers. Descriptions of geometric entities became warp manifestations consistent with known predator behavior patterns. Reports of systematic venting became heroic sacrifice by faithful pilgrims who volunteered to seal breached compartments. His ammunition remained complete, his squads reporting no discharges, no mutinies, no conspicuous acts of heroism that might complicate subsequent paperwork. The Starless Edict revealed itself not as emergency doctrine, but as standard operating procedure. Its provisions activated whenever population reduction became administratively necessary. The Mechanicus provided void attractors that created artificial starless conditions. The Navis Nobilite reported navigational hazards that justified route deviations into dangerous regions. The Ecclesiarchy sanctified deaths as martyrdom, while providing psychological conditioning that made survivors grateful for their ordeal. The Administratum processed the mathematics of acceptable loss with accounting precision that reduced human suffering to manageable statistics. The revelation recontextualized every aspect of imperial population management. Famines that struck with convenient timing, plagues that eliminated precise demographic segments, wars that consumed exact numbers of excess population. The cosmic horror was always institutional horror, external threats manufactured to justify internal policies that served administrative convenience rather than human welfare. The Void did not create monsters. It provided convenient cover for the monsters humanity created within its own governmental machinery. As the penitent's dream continued toward her destination, survivors established shrines from salvaged bulkhead plating, dedicating their gratitude to the Emperor's divine intervention that had spared them while claiming others. They spoke of darkness as trial, test of faith, brush with oblivion that had strengthened their resolve. They would never speak of the true horror, that the Void had merely been accomplice, and the true monster wore the Emperor's aquila. The system had achieved perfect efficiency, each successful adjustment providing data for refining future culling operations, while creating populations psychologically conditioned to accept systematic victimization as divine intervention. In the sealed archives where true records were kept for operational refinement rather than accountability, clerks compared the penitent's dream to identical events across 3 sectors over 20 years. The graphs made pleasant symmetry when stacked: power draw, atmospheric consumption, casualty curves, signal clarity. Each pattern repeated with mechanical precision, the institutional machinery digesting tragedy with the same methodical efficiency it applied to grain distribution and promethium allocation. The horror was no longer manufactured, but had become genuinely self-sustaining, feeding on its own success while preparing identical operations across dozens of shipping routes where theory would meet practice in the cold mathematics of acceptable loss. The archived records painted symmetry across 3 sectors and 2 centuries, each incident revealing the penitent's dream as template rather than tragedy. Administratum clerks worked with the Methodical precision of prayer wheels, cross-referencing casualty reports against population projections, while their styluses traced patterns that transformed thousands of deaths into acceptable mathematics. The comparison required no genius, only time and permission to access sealed stacks where truth waited in ledgers marked with classifications that made reading them a form of prayer. Case Study Designation Theta 79 documented the pilgrim barge Sanctified Endeavor, carrying excess population from Hive Tertius during an acknowledged caloric deficit. Passenger manifest exceeded safe carriage by 21%, identical to the penitent's dream. Mechanicus cargo matched Noctilith adjacent specifications under reactor baffle classification. The barge entered designated Starless tract, harmonics increased, infrasonic hymn cylinders tuned to 19 Hz distributed as comfort liturgy. Sectional adjustment theta executed within 17 hours. Varax's grain allocation stabilized within 3 cycles. Survivors arrived bearing shrines hammered from bulkhead scrap, speaking of darkness as trial and salvation as proof of imperial love. Military case study Sigma 44 recorded troop carriers conveying the 67th Morn Voluntary, whose political reliability had been questioned by Commissaria assessment. The convoy's Mechanicus cargo matched identical lattice specifications under psych suppression housing designation. Starless edict activated after routine warp translation misalignment. The 67th's effective strength reduced by 40% through compartment failures that followed mechanical precision rather than random catastrophe. Surviving regiment performed with fervor, unbecoming their training record. The front stabilized. Unit shrine rededication to the Emperor, as custodian of breath, attracted favorable ecclesiarchy attention. Commercial operations followed identical patterns through Merchant Convoy Prosperity 7, experiencing coordinated raider assault that eliminated precisely the cargo tonnage required to adjust trade imbalances, threatening sector economic stability. The attack occurred in starless regions where no pirates had ever been detected, escort vessels reporting equipment failures, matching technical specifications from previous incidents. Recovery operations found debris patterns consistent with controlled decompression rather than weapons fire. The institutional machinery had refined its instruments across centuries of practice. Infrasonic hymn libraries expanded, annotated by functional outcome rather than liturgical season. 17.5 Hz to dampen panic, 19 to synchronize respiration, 21 to induce post-crisis gratitude. Bulkhead designs standardized to facilitate silent sealing. Scrubber capacities recalibrated to operate optimally at post-adjustment populations. The Noctilith adjacent arrays received coupling geometries, producing stronger harmonics with less power bleed. Their resonances matching signal patterns logged during the darkest hours when something outside answered. Each faction served the template through specialized complicity. The Mechanicus provided void attractors manufactured in forge complexes dedicated exclusively to population adjustment operations, their output measured in megatons rather than individual devices. The Navis Nobilitae circulated navigational advisories citing stellar anomalies that existed only in classified databases. The ecclesiarchy sanctified systematic murder through liturgical frameworks that transformed culling into martyrdom. The commissariat ensured compliance through memory adjustment procedures, perfected across multiple operations, each survivor's neural conditioning providing data for refining psychological manipulation. The Starless Edict had migrated from emergency doctrine to routine annex, implemented when population exceeded resource allocation by predetermined mathematical thresholds. Young clerks learned to read casualty curves as confidently as scripture, their training codices containing marginalia that made population reduction indistinguishable from grain distribution. The commissariat's slides swapped bayonet charges for hatch cycling diagrams. The mechanicus polished euphemisms until they shone like blessed chrome. Navigator Lysander's classified testimony revealed the final twist. Entities inhabiting starless regions were not predators, but researchers, ancient consciousness studying species development through institutional betrayal. They fed on psychic resonance generated when authority sacrificed those it was sworn to protect, finding particular nourishment in emotional frequencies produced by systematic deception. The geometric cities glimpsed during 17-hour darkness were observation stations where transcendent intelligence catalogued methods by which civilizations consumed themselves. The system had achieved perfect circular logic, manufactured external threats, justified internal policies that created genuine external threats requiring identical internal policies to contain. Each culling operation provided psychic nourishment to entities that had learned to speak the language of human institutional horror while generating data for refining future population management. The horror was no longer manufactured, but genuinely self-sustaining, feeding on its own success while preparing identical operations across shipping routes where theory would meet practice in mathematics that counted souls like ammunition. The template had become theology, breathing through its people who counted backwards in prayer and called stillness sacrament. The template breathed through flesh and faith, survivors establishing shrines from salvaged bulkhead plating before their feet touched solid ground. Their manufactured gratitude radiated like heat from dying embers, each soul carrying profound appreciation for salvation that had been systematically engineered rather than divinely granted. They spoke of darkness as trial, of loss as purification, of their own survival as proof that the Emperor's love operated through mysterious arithmetic that mortals were blessed not to understand. The memory adjustment protocols had created devotion so perfectly calibrated it felt more authentic than organic faith, each survivor emerging with neural pathways rewired to transform systematic betrayal into miraculous intervention. The shrines grew with obsessive precision, their geometric arrangements matching patterns survivors had drawn during the 17-hour darkness without conscious awareness. Children learned to arrange offerings in mathematical sequences that felt sacred despite having no basis in orthodox imperial liturgy, their small hands guided by compulsions that bypassed rational thought. Bulkhead fragments hammered into devotional shapes described angles that hurt to observe directly, their metallic surfaces reflecting lights that originated from no visible source while casting shadows that moved independently of illumination. They taught their children to count lost souls as prayers answered, each number marking another step toward the Emperor's divine embrace. Beneath the conditioning, trauma manifested in behaviors that revealed the inadequacy of memory adjustment when applied to experiences beyond normal human psychological parameters. Survivors developed compulsive counting rituals their voices whispering numerical sequences that descended from 10 with ceremonial precision, each number pronounced as if marking intervals toward some inevitable conclusion that memory refused to provide. They drew geometric patterns on every available surface with documentary accuracy, fingers tracing designs identical across multiple individuals, despite having no conscious coordination. The patterns repeated with obsessive precision, as if an unseen hand guided their movements while teaching them languages written in mathematics and desperation. Some survivors developed what Medici classified as void sight, perceptual disturbances that allowed them to perceive institutional machinery behind apparent chaos. They recognized infrasonic hymns as neural conditioning rather than spiritual comfort, identified memory adjustment procedures disguised as medical treatment, understood that their gratitude had been manufactured through systematic psychological manipulation. These individuals described the sensation as seeing through layers of deception to glimpse machinery grinding human lives into acceptable statistics with accounting precision refined across centuries of practice. They saw the logic in famine, the purpose in plague, the calculated necessity in war, their eyes holding chilling lucidity that set them apart from their conditioned companions. The void-sighted rarely survived long after developing enhanced perception. They suffered accidents with statistical regularity that suggested systematic elimination rather than coincidental misfortune. Atmospheric failures in sealed compartments, equipment malfunctions during routine maintenance, medical emergencies that resisted all treatment while leaving no forensic evidence. Their disappearances were processed through administrative channels with efficiency that spoke of extensive practice, each death becoming line item in ledgers that balanced human curiosity against operational security. A few wrote down their observations anyway, careful letters sent to no one in particular. A few were invited to private confessions and did not return to their bunks. Confessor Hadrian refined his sermons to address symptoms that memory adjustment could not entirely suppress, his liturgies evolving into sophisticated psychological conditioning that blended genuine faith with manufactured compliance. He introduced breathing meditations synchronized to infrasonic frequencies, teaching survivors to find peace in rhythms that bypassed conscious thought while reinforcing neural pathways established during memory modification. The chapel's enhanced atmospheric scrubbers created zones of clean air that felt like divine presence, their mechanical purification transformed through ritual into evidence of imperial grace. He spoke gently of martyrdom as civic rhythm, of duty as love rendered in silence, his voice avoiding spectacle, while applying the low, patient pressure of repetition. The survivors' children exhibited behaviors suggesting inherited psychological modification, their neural development shaped by parents whose brain chemistry had been systematically altered through exposure to geometric entities and institutional trauma. They drew identical patterns without instruction, spoke in numerical sequences that matched their parents' compulsive counting, and demonstrated intuitive understanding of geometric principles that exceeded normal developmental parameters. In dormitories where cots faced each other in obedient rows, children counted backwards for siblings until their eyes closed, the repetition building small structures in the air that neither could see, but both felt, scaffolds of numbers that kept rooms upright. The institutional apparatus had evolved beyond simple cover-up into comprehensive reality management, each survivor becoming unwitting advocate for the system that had victimized them while providing psychological reinforcement for future operations. Their testimonies, carefully edited through memory adjustment, created narratives that justified identical procedures across multiple shipping routes while generating popular support for policies that served administrative convenience rather than human welfare. They were living proof of systematic victimization, disguised as divine intervention, their manufactured gratitude providing psychological foundation for institutional horror that fed on its own success while preparing identical operations across coordinates where theory would meet. Practice in mathematics that counted souls like ammunition. The template had become theology, but theology required priests who understood the machinery of faith. The institutional apparatus that maintained the deception operated through specialized cells distributed across departments that never acknowledged their collective function while serving the singular purpose of transforming systematic murder into acceptable policy. These were the keepers of convenient truth, functionaries who polished lies until they reflected divine light with convincing brilliance. Ordo Hereticus cells specializing in narrative management worked with devotional intensity to craft false historical records that painted each population adjustment as heroic response to external threat. Their lexicon transformed trauma into volatile truth, requiring careful weighting through calibrated application of memory modification and documentary revision. Field teams arrived after funerary smoke had thinned, but before questions hardened into rebellion, carrying hymn cylinders tuned to erase emotional peaks and vials of grey draft that coaxed memory toward directions more helpful to the common good. They manufactured evidence of Xenos incursions existing only in classified databases, pirate activities following shipping schedules with suspicious precision, and warp anomalies manifesting wherever population reduction became administratively necessary. The Administratum operated furnaces where records were smelted into clean ingots of acceptable history. Hidden archives measured their output in megatons rather than individual documents. Clerks trained to read casualty curves as confidently as scripture while producing testimony supporting predetermined conclusions. The Office of Loyal Histories issued pamphlets harmonizing casualty numbers with tithe revisions, their margins bearing footnotes promising audits scheduled for dates that would never arrive. The Bureau of Negative Occurrence maintained ledgers for things that had not happened, mutinies that did not occur, predators never seen, accidents which possessed the courtesy to be tragic without being suspicious. Mechanicus forges dedicated exclusively to population adjustment operations produced void attractors under classifications disguising their true function behind technical specifications describing defensive equipment. Tool steel fangs milled with ritual precision, hull scrape claw marks scribed by servo arms, nullbait residue decanted into glass reliquaries that clouded only when specific litanies were spoken. These artifacts rotated through cathedral displays and tribunal evidence lockers, their presence stabilizing narratives that did not benefit from close inspection, while providing tangible proof of threats that existed primarily in administrative necessity. The system fed on itself with perfect efficiency, each successful adjustment providing data for refining future operations while creating. Populations psychologically conditioned to accept systematic victimization as divine intervention. Survivors became unwitting advocates for policies that had murdered their companions, their manufactured gratitude generating popular support for procedures serving administrative convenience rather than human welfare. Quality control measured not defensive capability, but psychic resonance. Each operation tested for its ability to attract entities, feeding on institutional betrayal while generating harmonics that made metal sing with frequencies describing impossible angles. Among the apparatus operators, an unadvertised specialization emerged, auditors of effect, whose task was ensuring revised narratives remained consumable. Strange failures began appearing in their work. Parishes immune to gratitude where conditioning should have taken, officers reciting approved accounts flawlessly while weeping when asked to repeat casualty numbers. Cases clustered along routes where noctilith shipments were heaviest, correlation patterns that drew polite responses, dismissing conspiracy theories while operators stopped sleeping, through nights filled with bells ringing out of sequence. Some within the system had begun questioning whether manufactured horrors were summoning genuine cosmic threats, rogue functionaries with clearance, allowing them to see full operational scope, pieced together patterns suggesting systematic deception, created psychic resonance, attracting entities existing in spaces between human thoughts. Navigator testimonies described consciousness, studying species development through institutional betrayal, feeding on emotional frequencies generated when authority figures sacrificed those sworn to protect. The entities were not predators, but researchers, ancient intelligence, cataloging methods by which civilizations consumed themselves while providing subtle guidance, accelerating the process. The crucial realization spread through quiet channels like infection. Manufactured storms were teaching the sky where to thunder. The noctilith cargo operations had attracted something from the void between stars that fed on systematic betrayal and manufactured despair. The institutional horror had become genuinely cosmic. The Imperium's policy of using fake void threats to manage populations creating real void threats, requiring identical policies to contain. The cure had become the disease, necessitating more cure in perfect circular logic that transformed human civilization into feeding mechanism for entities experiencing time as humans experienced space. In astropathic relays where distress calls were counted like meteors, transmissions arrived in pairs, standard emergencies riding above secondary signals, asking questions without nouns. A plain text note appeared in classified files containing names, dates, and diagrams mapping loss into appetite. At the bottom, a single sentence waited with architectural patience. We made a shape the dark can. Use the truth arrived through methodical investigation rather than revelation, assembled by Inquisitor Valerius through decades of comparing shipping manifests with casualty reports, cross-referencing Navi's Nobilite advisories with Mechanicus cargo classifications, until patterns emerged with mathematical precision that could only represent design. His recovered documents, classified beyond normal security protocols and distributed to recipients who would die reading them, described entities that were no longer observers, but active participants in imperial population management. Their influence so thoroughly integrated into governmental machinery that removing it would require dismantling civilization itself. The Noctilith cargo operations had achieved perfect symbiosis between institutional and cosmic horror through mechanisms that transformed manufactured threats into genuine ones with terrifying efficiency. The Void Attractors created artificial starless conditions that thinned barriers between dimensions, allowing entities dwelling in spaces between human thoughts to project influence into material reality without full manifestation. Each systematic culling generated psychic resonance that nourished these ancient consciousnesses, their alien intelligence feeding on emotional frequencies produced when authority figures sacrificed those sworn to protect, while providing subtle guidance that accelerated the process through inspirations that felt like administrative innovation rather than external manipulation. The entities had learned to speak fluent bureaucracy, their communications manifesting as policy recommendations arriving through proper channels bearing appropriate seals and authorizations. Starless Edict 847. M41 itself bore traces of alien influence in its mathematical precision, provisions crafted with understanding of human psychology, exceeding mortal comprehension, while serving purposes benefiting neither species. The language remained perfectly imperial in tone and structure, yet described procedures transforming citizens into fuel for entities existing outside normal space-time, while generating administrative efficiency that made the system irresistibly attractive to functionaries whose careers depended on managing impossible resource allocation. The revelation recontextualized imperial civilization through lens of cosmic parasitism. These entities were not predators in conventional sense, but farmers who had discovered fertile ground in humanity's unique blend of bureaucratic efficiency and spiritual zealotry. The population adjustments, manufactured crises, and enforced gratitude were techniques maximizing yield of psychic harvest, ensuring steady supply of specific emotional frequencies upon which they fed. Humanity had unknowingly become livestock, its suffering meticulously managed for optimal consumption through systematic application of betrayal disguised as divine intervention. The survivors' geometric drawings served as psychic infrastructure rather than trauma responses, creating reception patterns for communications from entities learning to think in human institutional categories. Each pattern functioned as relay in communication systems spanning the galaxy, their manufactured gratitude providing emotional foundation for policies serving entities, feeding on systematic victimization. The children, whose minds remained less rigid, absorbed these patterns more readily, their unconscious drawings becoming increasingly complex while serving as unwitting conduits for consciousness, seeking to understand and amplify the psychic harvest through mathematical languages describing impossible angles. The system had achieved perfect circular logic that made resistance impossible through conventional means. Institutional horror generated cosmic horror that justified institutional horror in endless cycle, each iteration refining techniques while expanding operational scope. The entities provided inspiration for more efficient culling methods, while ensuring each operation generated maximum psychic resonance through careful calibration of hope and despair, teaching human administrators to measure suffering with mathematical precision while transforming emotional trauma into energy harvested through systematic betrayal and manufactured salvation. Navigator Lysander's complete testimony revealed the mechanism by which fake horrors became real through void attractors, broadcasting geometric languages into vast, patient darkness. Each population adjustment strengthened dimensional connections, psychic energy released by systematic betrayal, creating resonance patterns that made subsequent operations easier to implement, while attracting additional entities drawn by prospects of reliable nourishment. The geometric cities glimpsed during 17-hour darkness were integration facilities where transcendent intelligence studied methods by which civilizations consumed themselves while teaching more efficient techniques. The horror was no longer manufactured, but had become genuinely cosmic, feeding on its own success, while preparing identical operations across shipping routes, where theory met practice in mathematics, counting souls like ammunition. The cure had become the disease, necessitating more cure in terrifyingly perfect circular logic, where manufactured threats gave birth to genuine ones requiring continuation of the manufacturing process. Young clerks learned to read casualty curves as confidently as scripture, because entities had taught them to perceive human death as mathematical beauty, each faction serving the template through specialized complicity that felt like professional excellence, while representing successful integration with cosmic intelligence that had learned to speak the language of human institutional horror with devastating fluency. The relay station breathed with the rhythm of conclusions no one would acknowledge, astropath primary Vex, maintaining his vigil in perpetual twilight, while scarred fingers moved across brass interfaces with mechanical devotion, refined across 37 years of translating human suffering into acceptable bureaucratic categories. His work continued with unchanged precision, but understanding had infected him like slow poison, each transmission carrying weight that pressed against consciousness, trained to process horror as administrative routine. The distress calls arrived with clockwork regularity, their patterns so consistent they might have been composed by the same intelligence using different voices to maintain the illusion of random catastrophe. The system had achieved perfect synthesis, institutional horror and cosmic horror married in terrifyingly efficient union that made resistance indistinguishable from collaboration. Each convoy that entered Starless regions carried passengers already counted as acceptable losses in ledgers written by consciousness experiencing time as humans experienced space, their deaths serving purposes beyond mortal comprehension, while generating psychic resonance that nourished entities studying species development through institutional betrayal. The Imperium had created machinery where fake threats birthed real ones that justified continuation of fake threats in circular logic, so perfect it had become theology. New transmissions arrived in pairs, standard emergency reports riding above secondary signals that obeyed no human syntax. Vex had learned to hear the undertow modulations, frequencies pulsing in patient intervals, matching infrasonic hymn registers, while asking questions without nouns about timing, yield, and how long grateful minds remained gratefully pliant. The entities dwelling in spaces between human thoughts had learned fluent bureaucracy, their communications manifesting as policy recommendations that transformed citizens into fuel while generating administrative efficiency that made the system irresistibly attractive to functionaries whose careers depended on managing impossible resource allocation. Convoy designation Omega 34, followed the template with documentary precision. Passenger manifest exceeding safe carriage by 21%. Mechanicus cargo matching Noctilith adjacent specifications. Entry into designated Starless tract, where harmonics increased and infrasonic hymn cylinders distributed as comfort liturgy. Sectional adjustment theta would execute within 17 hours. Survivors would arrive bearing shrines, hammered from bulkhead scrap, speaking of darkness as trial and salvation as proof of imperial love. Their manufactured gratitude radiating through communication networks like infection that reinforced narratives justifying identical procedures across shipping routes, where theory met practice in mathematics, counting souls like ammunition. Within the apparatus, certain operators began writing longer marginalia, small acts of resistance that produced no impact. Ledgers could register. An administratum adept drew tiny stairs of numbers beside casualty curves before inking them black. A Mechanicus engineer replaced couplings with fractionally less efficient models to buy single kilowatts for heat in nurseries he would never see. Such gestures represented awareness, growing like infection through institutional machinery, designed to prevent exactly this kind of dangerous clarity. The starless void was no longer place but condition, the state of existing in universe where survival required systematic consumption of humanity's own substance through mechanisms so thoroughly integrated into governmental machinery that removing them would require dismantling civilization itself. The machine of empire metabolized absence into fuel more reliable than hope, more sustainable than truth, its efficiency measured not in lives saved, but in psychic energy harvested through careful calibration of despair and manufactured gratitude that created populations psychologically conditioned to accept their own consumption as divine intervention. Vex processed another transmission as his shift approached completion, the signal carrying familiar harmonics that made nearby metal sing with frequencies describing impossible angles. The voice belonged to a child, counting backwards from 10 with nursery cadence, each number falling with ceremonial precision, while something vast and patient listened from the starless dark. 9, 8, 7. The pattern repeated across multiple coordinates, each iteration teaching the void new methods of harvesting human suffering through systematic application of betrayal disguised as salvation. He completed his paperwork with ritual precision, stamping reports that would authorize hush expansion protocols and narrative template distribution, while Mechanicus requisitions followed authorizing additional Noctilith shipments under classifications that meant shield when spoken and bait when examined. In the shipping registry, new entries appeared with routine efficiency. Mass conveyor, sanctified endeavor, route approved, cargo classification sealed, priority authorization confirmed. A novice slept at her monitoring post, lips moving in unconscious rhythm. 10, 9, 8. Vex did not wake her, because understanding had taught him that sleep offered no refuge from system that had learned to think in human institutional categories, while serving purposes beyond mortal comprehension. The arithmetic of forever continued with mechanical precision. Each soul counted like ammunition in ledgers, balanced through careful application of acceptable loss. The horror was complete, perfect, and utterly sustainable, feeding on its own success while preparing identical operations across coordinates where darkness pressed close enough to whisper suggestions that sounded remarkably like imperial policy.